Okay. Hello and welcome to this special NPC webinar to mark the United Nations International Day of Older Persons. And the theme of that for 2021 is digital equality for all ages. Now, as General Secretary of the NPC, I have to state right up front that we are aware of the irony of having a webinar about digital exclusion, but the pandemic has for the moment pushed a lot of NPC meetings online like everybody else's. But we will be posting out a written report of this meeting to those of our members who are not online. We're delighted to welcome our guest speakers for today. We have Joe Stevens, MP, Shadow Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, Caroline Abrahams, CBE, Charity Director of Age UK, Dr. Jennifer Butte, a retired GP and founder of the dementia support charity Glorious Opportunity, and Jenny Sims, a chair of the NPC Digital Working Party and presenting their report on scams and the impact on older people. Now, I'd like to introduce you to Jonathan Safer. He's going to tell you how he's going to be managing the webinar and explain the format. Okay, Jonathan?
Hi there, I'm Jonathan Safer, as Jan said. There's not too much in terms of housekeeping, but if you do have any questions that you'd like to put to our panelists, please use the Q&A function that you should be able to see at the bottom of your screens. Just type your questions and we will try and get round to answering them, hopefully at the end of either each person's little speech, or towards the end we'll have a roundup. If we don't get round to answering all of the questions, we will try and compile a list and try and get them answered. But if we don't get time for that, apologies. I'll hand you back to Jan now and we can continue.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Jonathan. So the title of today's discussion is Connections for All, Digital and the Right to Choose. Because feedback from a great many of our members suggests that they often feel excluded from increasingly digitalized world, and that we have little or no choice in the matter. Now, whether it's to have banking online and buy your groceries with a debit or credit card, or have an internet video consultation with a GP, the world is skyrocketing towards digital-only communications. And that's been greatly fueled by 18 months of lockdown during the pandemic. Yet research by Age UK, for example, shows that nearly 2 million over 75s still do not use the internet, despite the pressures of the pandemic. The reasons for not being online range from fear of scams, as much as lack of knowledge and confidence, never mind the money to buy a laptop or broadband. But some older people simply do not want to use the internet, even if they could, or if they indeed had any training to do so. It's not acceptable to just discount our rights to choose how we stay connected to suit government and corporate agendas. We need to ensure that businesses, government, and even the NHS, which has seen a rise in GP internet video consultations, offer people a choice of ways to communicate, whether this is by telephone, letter, face-to-face, or online. Earlier this year, the NPC launched our Connections for All campaign, and we absolutely appreciate the many benefits being online can bring older people. But we wanted to highlight the scale of digital poverty and end the exclusion of older people from our increasingly digitalized world. We want to promote digital inclusion for older people through training and access to free broadband, free online security, and digital devices like tablets and smartphones, but also to ensure that we have a choice whether we use digital devices or not. And if that means organisations must offer call centres with staff trained to help our oldest and most vulnerable, a slow mail service for those that wish to want to write letters, or indeed a shop front or office reception to see people face to face, then that's what needs to happen. However, for those who would like to go online and find the ever-updating technology and software confusing and frightening, then isn't it time that the organisations that profit and benefit from digital use invest a little of their money in simpler to use one-button technology, cheap broadband, and crucially safer and more secure broadband for older and more vulnerable users? We know there are service providers who are working towards these aims, but a great many are not. When a Conservative watchdog, the Financial Conduct Authority, announced this week that social media firms were serving as a gateway for scammers, you can take it that scamming is reaching epidemic proportions. The banks also this week have launched a 159 phone line to report banking scams, and the police action fraud services work hard to stem the tidal wave of online fraud. But they are the Davids combating criminal Goliaths. Is it then time that the government stepped up its fiscal measures to tackle online fraud and scams? They threw everything at the COVID epidemic, so why not the scams epidemic, which devastates ordinary people by robbing their savings and leaving huge emotional as well as financial scars? An incredible 2.3 billion was lost to victims of fraud in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland last year. This is a totally unacceptable figure. And shouldn't people be more protected and indeed recompensed when they are defrauded in this way? This week, Shadow Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, Jo Stevens, MP, criticised the government for failing to protect people from the scammers and from not tackling the issue properly in their new online harms bill. We did invite the previous Secretary of State, Oliver Dowden, for DCMS, but unfortunately, before he could answer our request, he's lost his post, and his successor, Noreen Dorris, has apologised because obviously the timescale was too tight for her. But we are delighted, however, to have Shadow Secretary of State Jo Stevens with us today. And she does have to leave more or less after her presentation, very busy lady. So we do welcome you, Jo. So would you like to give your presentation to us now?
Thank you very much indeed, Jan, for your kind invitation and your welcome. And thank you all for joining us today. I hope you've all had a good week. You might have noticed actually that it's been Labour Party conference this week. So I'm now back home in Cardiff in my constituency after a really busy time in Brighton, where I actually spent most of my time talking about online harms and online safety, both to the conference hall and to meetings with many, many different stakeholders. When Keir Starmer asked me to join his shadow cabinet as Shadow Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport last year, all of us were just 1 week into a national lockdown. And it took until this week for Keir to have the opportunity to set out in his speech to a conference hall filled with people, rather than a Zoom screen, his vision and values for our country. And I was so pleased to hear him place such importance on digital technology, digital skills, most importantly, security in his speech. Because security doesn't just mean national security or feeling secure in our communities or our homes. It means feeling secure when we're online, whether that's when we're using public services like healthcare, and Jan mentioned about hospital appointments and things like that in her introduction, or when we use commercial services like banking or shopping. So today I thought I would talk a bit about what I think and what Labour thinks should be done by the government to make our lives online safer, a safer and more secure experience. Now, sadly, I'm not the Secretary of State, I'm the Shadow Secretary of State in opposition. So my job is to push our current government to listen, to think and to act so that a piece of legislation called the Online Safety Bill it's about to start its journey through Parliament. We want that to be fit for purpose. And I don't just mean fit for purpose now in the online space that we spend a lot of our time, But this new piece of law has to be fit for the future too. We don't often get the opportunity to put new law into place. Parliamentary time is very limited. So I want to make sure that this new law is as good as it possibly can be. And I'm determined to work with whoever to make sure that that is the case. Because this bill has been a long time in coming. The government first promised legislation in 2017, so we've waited for nearly 5 years for the online safety bill. And at the moment, all we have is a draft bill. It's not the final bill that will be debated in Parliament. The government promised world-leading legislation on online safety. And in those nearly 5 years since that original promise, we've been waiting for this bill. And we've seen social media companies like Facebook and Twitter, and big tech companies like Google and YouTube, and huge online shops or marketplaces, as they like to be known as, like Amazon, make billions and billions of pounds in profit. At the same time, we've seen growing levels of child abuse, self-harm and suicide content, anti-vaccination misinformation, discrimination, hate speech, fraud, and scams rocket, absolutely rocket. And so clearly something has gone badly wrong. And this is why we urgently need the online safety bill, and we need it to be fit for purpose now and in the future. Fortunately, all we currently have is a rather weak and watered down bill that doesn't even satisfy the basic duty of government, and that's to keep its citizens safe. In the last financial year, it's been reported there were 4.6 million fraud offences, 4.6 million, and that's a 24% increase from 2 years ago. Online shopping and auction fraud, so sites like eBay, for example, went up an astonishing 57%. It meant that more than £2.3 billion was lost by victims in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. All of that means fraud is now the most commonly experienced crime, and that means a financial hit for millions of people. Beyond that, I know, and I've been a victim of it, that online fraud also means feeling you've been manipulated. It has a real and often devastating psychological impact as well as that financial impact. And many of my constituents describe the same feeling, and I hear stories from MPs across Parliament the same. So it's no surprise that the Money and Mental Health Institute reported that 3 in 10 scam victims are feeling depressed. And that's before we even consider the wider impacts of online fraud. You know, we know from the Police Foundation that over 1/3 of fraud can be linked to organised crime. So fraud is not just a horrific crime in itself, it's what I would call a funding multiplier for other serious crime, like drug running, child sexual exploitation, and people trafficking. And we see the real harm that causes on the streets of our villages, towns, and cities every day. Now, yet faced with that whole range of financial, psychological, and criminal devastation from fraud, we have a government response that is, I'm sorry to say, silent, unbothered, and unconcerned. Action against fraud is, and continues to be urgent and essential. We're not seeing it from government. Labour is leading calls for tough action on fraud. It's not just us. You'll know that financial campaigner Martin Lewis is doing it too, so are victims, so are the City of London Police, the Financial Conduct Authority, and the financial services industry. We are all calling for action. So this is a test for the new Secretary of State for Digital. And is she going to accept that doing nothing is no longer an option? I really hope not. Is she going to accept that her government leaving millions of citizens at risk of financial crime online is unacceptable? I hope not. And that long list of victims cannot and must not grow longer and longer. So that's why I'm repeating our call for action on fraud in the online safety bill. Now, at the moment, there is nothing in the bill to include online fraud and scams. It's explicitly carved out of the bill. So it's not in scope, and it leaves fraudsters and scammers free to continue their assault on the public. I have made clear to the government that this isn't good enough, and I'll continue to do that on behalf of the Labour Party, both in Parliament and outside. And I want to join with anyone who shares that concern and wants to see something happen to prevent this continuing problem. We have to have effective measures that tackle the scourge of online fraud, included in the Online Safety Bill. We also need meaningful enforcement and penalties that deter the big tech companies from turning a blind eye to the crimes that are facilitated on their products. You know, we have to be properly tough on fraud and tough on the main channels of fraud. It cannot be right that paid for advertising by criminals is excluded from the Online Safety Bill. And it cannot be right unsafe products boosted by fake reviews are excluded from the Online Safety Bill. And it cannot be right that powerful companies are profiting from this harmful activity because the government won't put in place a legal framework that provides the incentive to shut down these practices. I want to see criminal penalties for big tech company directors who repeatedly fail to ensure that online platforms comply with new, good online safety law. And yes, big financial penalties too. Yes, let's hit the bottom line where we have those aggravated offences occurring. We know that the threat of a criminal conviction works. We know because we've got one in our banking sector and in health and safety legislation for company directors. We've seen that it has improved the conduct of companies in those sectors. Tech companies aren't a special case. Their products should be safe for us to use. I used to be a lawyer before I was an MP, and so I come at this from a product safety design angle. If you want to make a pharmaceutical product, a new medicine, and you want to put it on the market, you have to go through a series of stages where you make sure that what you have created is safe. You identify the risks, if there are risks, and then you put in place mitigation measures to either remove those risks completely or minimize them to a negligible level. It's the same with things like children's toys. You know, you build it into the design, you look at product safety, you risk assess, and you put mitigation in place. If it's not safe to use, it shouldn't be on the market. So the Online Safety Bill has to do what it says on the tin. It must give the regulators the powers they need to make online platforms take responsibility for the serious consumer harms that are happening on their sites every single day. We have waited long enough for the government to crack down on today's biggest crime in society. And if they're not prepared to step up to the plate on this, then I promise you that we will. Thank you.
Thank you, Jo. That is most interesting. And as you would imagine, it's created quite a lot of questions and comments. I think really, I'll take Violet's first, because she talks about maybe taking it further than outside of the UK. And what she's saying is there needs to be a serious attempt to protect the public online. And this bill needs to be not for the protection of the market, but to protect individuals. The problem is the mixed laws involved in the situation, which organisations can hide behind. So I was just scrolling down. And these are often international laws. And you talked about, criminal activity, and that is not just exclusive. It doesn't just exclusively happen in the UK. A lot of the trafficking of children and adults comes from abroad. So what she's saying is they are in international laws, therefore cooperation between the nations, and other countries is vital. And I think that is one of the major issues there. There's a question from Alan in Scotland. Do these laws also apply to Scotland? I'm sure you could answer that. And Gillian Crow would like to know what the bill actually says. I mean, I'm sure that what you said it doesn't say is more interesting to us than what it does say, but perhaps you just give a very quick resume of that. Yeah. Okay, Jo. Thank you.
Shall I take those first 3 points?
Yeah.
Straight?
Yeah.
Okay. So on Violet's observation, you're absolutely right, Violet. And actually, international cooperation is something that I've been involved in for the last 4 years. Before I joined the Shadow Cabinet, I was on the Digital Select Committee in Parliament, working with a group of cross-party MPs, so MPs from all parties there. And we built up a group of international parliamentarians from Canada, Argentina, Malaysia, the United States, France, a number of other countries, through one of our inquiries where we were working on fake news and disinformation. And a lot of what I learned about harms online, both in terms of the things that I talked about in my address to you, but also financial scams as well, came from speaking with MPs from other countries, learning where the problems are, and what we've been trying to do, and that group of MPs, international MPs, are still working together we're trying to work together to take a coordinated approach to this, so that there are other countries that have got online harms legislation in place. There are some countries that are currently doing what we're doing, which is trying to put some law in place. But we're trying to make sure that we approach it from the same point and through the same lenses. So I hope that will reassure you that there are those discussions going on, because you're absolutely right, international cooperation is at the heart of this. And these are international companies that we're talking about, the tech companies that host the products where these crimes are taking place. Do the laws apply to Scotland? Alan is asking. The online harms bill will be a UK-wide bill. Excuse me. Obviously, Scotland has its own criminal law and jurisdiction. And so this will be a UK bill. And if we are successful in getting criminal penalties included in the bill, then there'll obviously have to be within the bill recognition that this would apply in all 4 nations of the United Kingdom. And Gillian, this is the question, what does the bill actually say? Well, it's a huge bill, it's well over 100 pages. But if I could kind of summarize it in a couple of sentences, it only applies to what's called user-generated content. So it's targeted primarily at social media companies and what people produce, write, video, and put online. Paid advertisements are outside the scope of the bill. So I mentioned about, you can be a fraudster, and you could go on Twitter and put your fraudulent claim on Twitter, and the bill would cover that in terms of, it might be an online harm that would come within the terms and conditions of Twitter, of use of being able to have a Twitter account. But I can pay for an advert that essentially is a fraudulent advert, and it will be outside the scope of the bill. So they will make money from me as a criminal fraudster putting an advert on their platform. So there's a clear anomaly there and a problem that needs to be resolved. The other thing that it does, which is the main problem I think with the bill, is that it allows the platforms to self-regulate. So under this bill, the only duty of care on the platforms will be around transparency. They will have to show Ofcom their terms and conditions of people using their platform, and provided that they monitor their terms and conditions and they do that properly, they will satisfy what's required under the law. So there's no incentive there, because if I was Mark Zuckerberg, for example, I would make the terms and conditions of using Facebook absolutely minimal, because then all I have to do is show Ofcom that I've satisfied that. So there's no incentive to have good, robust terms and conditions that mean that people can't do harmful things on that platform. Mm-hmm. I think that probably covers that's covered that. So
can I just move on to why we're here today? I've got a message from Tony Garner, who's from our Eastern region. And it says, this morning I got a new COVID test kit from my pharmacy and was given a leaflet. In future, we will need a code to collect them. And this can be done online or with a QR code on a smartphone, or by phoning 119, the usual COVID number. So if you phone, you will be sent a code by text or email to print and take to your pharmacy. So I'm not sure how those who are not online and do not have a phone with textability can print it. Now, this is where the exclusion of older people is massive, because most older people don't own a smartphone. They can't afford it. Yeah. If they do, they don't often use the apps because they cost you for data. Yeah. And this links with a question that we've actually had from Mr. Dick Fowler from Lincolnshire. And his first question is failing to offer alternatives to digital-only communications, not discrimination, under the Equality Act 2010? And can we move the government and business to listen, and use that legislation? So there's two little questions there, but I think that example says exactly why we're here today.
Absolutely. And I can speak from personal experience here. I'm in my mid-50s. I went through all my schooling, my education. Calculators weren't used in school at that time. And so, I understand absolutely the feeling of exclusion from modern technology. And I have, my mum is, she's starting to learn to use digital devices, but she's not comfortable, and she feels that she's almost been made to do it. She would rather not do it, but she's been put in a position where she has to do it because she hasn't got any choice. So for me, the absolute kind of important word in all of this is choice. We shouldn't be saying to people that you have to use online services. There should always be a choice about whether you do or you don't. On the issue of affordability, I'm very conscious that today is the day that the cut to universal credit of £20 will take effect. I'm very conscious about the cost of rising utility bills, and in a way, access to online services, access to broadband is as essential for many people, not everybody, but for many people, it's as essential as gas, electricity, and water. And so we need to think about broadband and internet access in the same sort of framework, I think, as other utilities. But there must always be the option for people not to use online services if they don't want to do so. And frankly, the level of fraud that is going on, it's hardly surprising that many people don't want to do that. So choice has to be at the heart of policy making. And whether or not it's discriminatory, I don't know. If it is, maybe someone will bring a challenge to it. It's quite complex, discrimination law, whether it's direct discrimination or indirect discrimination through public policy. But I think if you put choice at the heart of public policy making, and one of the things that I spoke about in my speech this week in Labour Party conference, and Keir also spoke about it, is that we want to have what's called a well-being index in government. So when you make decisions in any department of government, as well as looking at the cost, and the Office for Budget Responsibility keeps a very careful eye on that, we want to make sure that any government decisions made on any matter, you think about the impact on people's well-being. And in that would be thinking about, does this impact and disadvantage a certain group of the population as against another, and will it improve well-being? So that would be at the heart of all our decision making.
Thank you, Jo. I think, it's quite clear from our members and possibly from the organisations like Age UK, Independent Age, and all the other organisations that work with and for older people, that scams are the major issue, as well as finance. Lots of people live on their basic state pension plus a small occupational pension and don't get pension credit. So don't get any of the accesses to other benefits that would help people. I just want to go back to Dick's second question, and it kind of resonates. He's been writing to the DCMS on a regular basis, as has the NPC. We do get a reply, which is incredible, since most of the government departments decide not to write back to us, but they do reply. And we do get a lot of very useful information based on getting people online. However, the one question they have yet to answer, and we have written to them 3-4 times now, the last twice on specifically getting an answer to this question, which is, what is the government going to do to enable people to have their human right to choice and have alternatives to digital information and online information? They seem either unable or unwilling to answer that question. Is there a suggestion how we can get through this kind of like roadblock?
Well, I am very happy to raise that with the new Secretary of State on your behalf. I'm sure I'll be meeting her. Parliament is in recess this week and next week, or next week and the week after. But I hope to have a meeting with the new Secretary of State when we're back, and I'd be more than happy to raise that directly with her. So if you drop me a line with exactly what you want asked, I will do that.
I'll send you a copy of our last letter, which is quite telling, and you know, that's it. Right. In terms of the NPC and where we stand, we do work with Jackie Killeen from the Commission of Equality and Human Rights, and she wrote to me yesterday. They've just finished a consultation on their 2022-2025 plan, and they're looking very closely at digital exclusion, AI, algorithms, all of those things that we're all party to now, that people seem to think take the place of being a human being and a human body. Indirect discrimination looks to be the way, but even that is fraught with problems, because if you look at age particularly, we're here for older people specifically, but we do understand that, you know, low-income families, even young people, are excluded, you know, because they haven't got the finances or the wherewithal, or just don't want to, like we do, not to engage with this thing that sends people across the world. So we'll continue to talk with Jackie and see where we get. But it's, I think, slightly easier to take a case on disability than it is on age. And age has always been an issue around the Equality 2010 Act. But the Equality 2010 Act does say that businesses and public bodies should deliver their services equally to all their customers. So I think that's where maybe the challenge will come, not the discrimination end of it. Yeah.
Well, so that's good to hear. I mean, what I should say actually is I've been doing some work along with my shadow ministers on digital rights and digital exclusion, and specifically around the issue of algorithms and machine learning, and we do know there's plenty of evidence to show that there are groups that are discriminated against through the deployment of AI. I would like to see in the future essentially people to have digital rights and you know, covering all sorts of aspects, including rights about how our data is held, rights about access and choice, and about standards in public service that if people are using public services that are digital, you can be sure that there is a minimum standard that is guaranteed across the sector. So there's a lot of work to do, and if any members here or any of your members who are not at the webinar today have views on that, I'd really love to hear them, because, you know, for me, our services should be designed with the people that use them in mind. They're the most important people in the process. So rather than looking at the thing at the end, when it's already done and it's been rolled out, and now we say, and people say, actually, so for example, the question about the pharmacy and everything, you know, why that doesn't work for people, we should be thinking about that at the beginning, not at the end.
Yeah,
so I hope that, you know, so I'd be very happy to work with you with any ideas that you think could feed into making sure that we are as inclusive as possible with our services.
Thank you. I think that's really important for us. And I think one of the other things is, why is it that the government doesn't want to take a tougher line? Is it about, you know, doing something to pay lip service to, you know, an election promise, yeah? Or is it the fear that, you know, these are the people that pay most, you know, into the country and take most out of it? What is it with them? Why won't they take the tougher line with these people?
I don't know. I don't know, because it's not just the stuff that we've all talked about today that is the issue. You know, many of these companies minimize the tax that they pay as well to our treasury. So I think there are tech companies that are as powerful, if not more powerful, than governments of developed countries around the world. And they have been allowed to grow and become so powerful, I think partly because there is this fear that you can't regulate technology. Of course you can regulate technology. It's a sector like any other sector in the economy. It just takes bravery and focus and determination to do it. And you can either say we're frightened of these people, you know, and leave it and, you know, be persuaded by them. And they spend a lot of money on lobbying governments around the world. Mm-hmm. And there is a lot of sort of revolving doors between people who have been elected representatives in countries and are now senior people in those big tech companies. But, you know, I say, if you're thinking about public policy and what is good for the citizens of the country, and I go back to that point I made about the basic duty of government is to keep its citizens safe, you have to have that at the forefront of your mind. And that is why we need this legislation, and we need good legislation as quickly as possible, because every day too many people are being harmed by it, and it will continue as long as the government fails to act.
Yeah. I've got a lot of things coming in, Jo, but I'm aware that you've got to leave. Yeah. And I'm also aware that we're just slightly a little bit over time now. But if, you know, if you don't mind, we will write to you.
Please do.
And list the questions that we've not been able to put in. There's lots of interesting things, and lots of interesting things coming in about bus station travellers getting away with their travel shops, and you have to ring our number to get a timetable even. So, you know, it comes, you know, it's crazy. So thank you so much for your time. We really do appreciate it.
Well, thank you.
Be in touch. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan, and thank you, everybody. Please send in anything you think would be helpful, and let's continue the conversation. Thank you.
We will. Thank you, Jo.
Bye.
Okay, moving on. I'd like to now introduce Caroline Abrahams, CBE. Most recently, congratulations, Caroline, of Age UK. She's Charity Director of Age UK. Now, Age UK has conducted some of the most insightful research on the digital exclusion of older people. I mean, in March this year, they found that nearly 2 million over 75s were still not online, which Caroline actually said debunked the idea that the pandemic had prompted a headlong rush online by older people. Age UK has also flagged up the disappearance of cash from our daily transactions in preference to digital banking and debit or credit cards. And with so many older people relying on cash to pay for bills and groceries, Age UK is calling for banks and businesses to retain cash as an alternative choice. And that's something that the NPC wholeheartedly agrees with. So, Caroline, is digitalisation moving too fast for our older citizens, and what can be done? So I welcome you this morning. Give you a
Thank you very much. It's lovely to see you, Jan, and hi everybody. It's great to be with you. I'm sorry that Jo had to rush off, because I think you could have probably had a good interaction with her for quite a bit longer. But I'll try and say something of use to you along the way. Shall I just start off by just picking up your baton around cash, Jan? That might be useful. I just wanted to say that Age UK is part of we're on a panel of organisations that include all the major banks and various other consumer groups who are working together with the support of certainly the sort of green light, I think, from the regulator and also from government to a degree, on what we could do to make cash safe and available in local areas for people of all ages. You know, obviously older people in particular, we know, tend to depend on cash and really struggle if they can't get hold of it. And we saw that through the pandemic. But of course, it's not only older people, it's small and medium-sized businesses too. It's traders, it's all kinds of people need cash. And so this group is working together to come up with various ideas as to how to ensure that. Things like protecting the existing ATMs so that people can access those, stopping them all becoming ones you have to pay to use, and looking at whether we could expand the use of cash, that you could just get from local shops and things like that. Also, the role of the post office, and probably most ambitiously of all, whether in some areas which are badly served, you could have a single banking hub that all the banks take part in, which is quite a change given the sort of competition that prevails within the banking sector. But the good news is we are making good progress. This project is it's been running for 6 months. It's due to finish, I think, at Christmas. So I think by the time we get to Christmas, there will be some announcements. And it's not going to solve the problem for everybody, of course. But I think it's, however difficult it is, it's good being around the table with these very, very important and rich banks over what they're going to do. And I think there will be some good things to say as a result of it. So that's on cash and what we're doing on cash. But I think what Jan really wanted me to talk about today was, and Beverly too, was the work that Age UK has been doing to track how older people have been using the internet or not during the pandemic, whether the pandemic made a big difference or not, because we know that there's a bit of a thing in the media, wasn't there, with people saying, oh yeah, well, there's all these older people now all going online because all using Zoom like us today. Really, is that what happened? So my colleagues decided to have a look and do some research on it. And I should probably start by saying that was against a context in which we've done quite a lot of research on older people's attitudes and use of the digital technology over the last few years. And what we know is that obviously, the kids of today, if you've got grandchildren or, next door neighbours' kids, they sort of pick up a smartphone like we used to perhaps pick up a pencil. It's absolutely part of their lives and, they love it. It's very different, isn't it, if you didn't grow up with learning those things or didn't have to use it at work. And that's still the position, of course, for very many older people. And that's reflected in the numbers. So even amongst sort of fair, middle-aged and older people. So a large majority of 50 to 64-year-olds, 88%, use the internet every day. So that's up to the age of 64. That's all, an awful lot of people are using the internet. When you go to the next level up, which is the 65 to 74-year-olds, 75% of them are using the internet every day. We don't know how. It might be on a smartphone, it might be a tablet, it could be a PC, but probably a smartphone or a tablet. But once you get to the age of 75, there's quite a change. So from that age onwards, only about half of people are using the internet. And the other thing just to remember with all of this that we found, which is quite interesting, is that just because an older person is using the internet today, doesn't mean that they're always going to use it. Sometimes people come off as well. They're not just all joining the internet and staying there. Some of them are coming off, and that could be for all kinds of reasons. It could be costs, as Jan suggested. It could also, and I think probably more often because of health or disability reasons, or if for one reason or other don't feel able or don't want to use internet all the time, or at all. So it's not that people get to it and stick. Quite a few people then come off as well. So we looked at what was happening for the 50 pluses in terms of their internet use during the pandemic, and two fifths of people aged 52 and over in England, so it's just England, said they had been using the internet more since the start of the pandemic. But the really interesting thing was that amongst those people, the usage had increased most among people who were already online. So somebody who was already online was using it more. So they might have started using Zoom calls, for example, to keep in touch with their friends and families. having had it and perhaps only used it before for shopping or email. What we didn't see was that the pandemic was leading lots and lots of older people to suddenly think, okay, now I'm going to get online for the first time, having not done so before. And among those aged over 75, only around a quarter were using the internet more, and 1 in 10 were actually using it less, as I've said. So from that age onwards, there's a lot of there is coming and going around use of the internet. Interestingly, when we looked at those over 75s and asked them what their attitudes were to using the internet, only 15% said they would like to use it more. And when we asked, well, why don't you want to do that then? What's holding you back, as it were? The most common barrier that people referred to was just not having the skills to do it, not knowing how to use it. And that was particularly true for the over 75s, where nearly 4 out of 5 of people mentioned that. And then the next most common response amongst that age group was a lack of trust, probably partly because of those scam and fraud issues that we were just hearing about, or not having access to the equipment or to the broadband, which I think touches on the issues around income. Of course, it is quite expensive to be able to use all these things. You've got to have that basic infrastructure. Of course, some people just don't have it where they live, but I think it was probably more likely choice and cost. We asked then older people, what would most help you to gain those digital skills you say you haven't got? And there were pretty clear preferences there. What people wanted was some one-to-one support that kind of would work for them around their needs and preferences. So for some, that might mean going to somewhere to do it, but it might even be someone coming to help them. And traditionally, digital inclusion programs have relied on face-to-face support. But of course, during the pandemic, that wasn't possible. And there was much more emphasis on over the phone or indeed via a video call. But then if you're not online in the first place, of course, that becomes very difficult. And so in our experience, a lot of local age UKs in particular provide digital inclusion sessions. We're quite successful in getting money from some of those companies to help us put those things on. And quite often we find that older people with some support absolutely fly with technology and really enjoy it. And it's not unusual for us to hear an older person say, I didn't really think I was interested in it before, but now that I've had a go, I really like it, and I can see it can make a difference. But it takes people time, and not everyone is going to rush into it. And that's quite a resource-heavy job. And although as I say, we're quite successful in attracting funding, we could always do with some more, basically. And there's never going to be enough for everybody. And the other absolute truth is some people will never be online, and that should be okay too. It should be, just as everyone else is saying, our view is too, it should be a choice. People shouldn't feel compelled to do it. And there should always be an alternative that is user-friendly, is affordable, that, it's not fair for people to lose out, for example. And I guess we're seeing some of these debates raging at the moment around access to GPs and the use of telephone and remote, Dr. IQ type of things like I have at my surgery, And one of the things that certainly occurred to me about that for my own use, and when I was using it for my mum, who wasn't very well and wasn't able to use it for herself, was that, my surgery is incredibly responsive to the app that they've suggested we use. But if they're responding that quickly to me, what's happening to someone who's trying to get through on the phone? Or, so there is a definite issue of inequity here and a need to level the playing field. But quite how we do that is another matter, because as you've been talking and saying in the previous session, there's not an obvious way of knowing how to do that, and we don't see huge enthusiasm from the government for getting involved. As long as I've worked at Age UK, particularly actually earlier on, I was part of a group that was I think I'm trying to remember what it was called now, but it was basically all sorts of people trying to encourage more people to get online. Martha Lane Fox was involved in it, and lots of interesting contact with government about them putting money into supporting older people to get online. What came out of it? Diddly squat. as far as I can see, the government's put virtually no money whatsoever into supporting older people to get online. Where they have put money in, it's tended to be to help younger people acquire skills or to help small and medium-sized enterprises get online. But so far, they've shown absolutely no interest in putting any money behind older people getting online, which is a shame. And, you know, we're seeing the consequences of that now. So I don't want to outstay my welcome, so I'm going to shut up now. I hope that's enough. But that's essentially what we found. People during the pandemic who were already online, some of them used it more often and enjoyed it, and that's great. But not a huge upsurge of people suddenly deciding now was the time to get that dusty tablet out and give it a go.
Thank you, Caroline. Yeah, you've caused a bit of a stushy on the on the questions. I think what I'd like to ask on behalf of our members, there is an issue about the assumption of the government. You touched on it slightly. The assumption of the government and the ruling powers is that younger people are online, and as they get to be a pensioner like us, they will have all the skills that is required. Now, we don't think that that is a proper assumption to make. And you've kind of sort of said how it affects 75 pluses. And I've got something here from Aisha, who is from Anglia. And she says that there are days that she just she's not able to understand her computer with all the updates and information that flashes up on the screen. And I myself have to say, sometimes I get really frustrated when I'm on a website that's sending me around in circles and there's no trying to find a number to ring to find out something, and it's just not there. It's very frustrating. So I think that's a wrong assumption, and you touched on that slightly. And there's also another assumption that everybody has a member of a family or a trusted friend that can help you get online and do your business. And I don't think that, again, because of the security issue, not every family takes care of their older people. Not every friend is a true friend. And we know, Caroline, you and I, that in-family fraud is increasing. And it's devastating, and it leaves emotional scars as well as the financial scars as well. And I want to go back to something that Mr. Fowler wrote to us and said, you know, should we not start owning the language, right, the terminology? And I think it's quite a good idea, right? So he's saying is, should we, for example, look at online only being treated as deliberate exclusion? I mean, that is quite a big thing to be looking at, but I understand where it's coming from. Sure. How do you view that, Caroline?
Okay, so just to comment on a couple of things you said there, Jan. When I talk to people in government or business or whatever about this issue, their first response is to assume that everybody who's older is online too. They don't understand that lots and lots of, I mean, I'm so bored with the statistic about, less than half of over 75s being online. You know, I quote it all the time, but actually most people aren't aware of it. Even people who ought to be aware of it don't realise that. So and if you think about it, if you think about how technology has taken over our world over the last few years, it's incredibly quick change, really. You know, I'm not that much younger than you, and I remember the first PCs coming in at work and things like that, and those great big huge things. And I remember as a student going to visit Imperial College's computer lab, and it was some vast room with these enormous things. You know, the world has changed so fast. So I think younger people today, they're so dependent on it, they're so integrated to their lives, they really can't understand what it would be like not to be that person. So there's a huge cultural gap, I think. So that's the first thing. It's a huge issue around awareness. And sometimes the statistics that are put out about older people online, particularly by companies, are incredibly unhelpful, because what happens is they do an online survey and then they draw the conclusions out to draw really optimistic conclusions about how many older people are online, conveniently forgetting about the fact that anyone who was offline would never have taken part in the survey. So it sounds ridiculously obvious, but that's the basic level of lack of awareness we're dealing with. So that's the first thing. On the should we go down the human rights route, which is a very legitimate question. I suppose, I'm an arch pragmatist, as I think you know. And, this government's not interested in human rights. In fact, not only is it not interested in it, it's actively hostile to human rights. If you want to get your letter blanked, just put human rights in it, because they just don't engage. They're just, and as we know, they're probably at the moment within the Ministry of Justice thinking about how to get us out of the United Nations Convention on Human Rights, or the EU Convention. That's how disinterested they are. So rights arguments don't tend to get you very far with this government. That's the brutal reality. It'd be different if Jo was in power, but she's not, unfortunately. So got to use the arguments that work, I think. And secondly, on the equality duties, it was really interesting what you were saying, I thought, Jan. And I'm afraid I agree with you. There have always been problems about enforcing the age-related elements of that. And it's a pretty toothless bit of legislation. Trying to win on it is ever so hard. So whatever we might all think about the rights and wrongs of the arguments, unfortunately, I think the chances of success with them are very, very thin. But that could change over time with a different government. But with this government, it's not going to get us very far, I'm afraid.
No, they're not in listening mode at all, are they? It's
well, not on rights.
Move forward with everything and anything, because nobody will say anything, and the few of us that stand up to them are just, our letters go in the bin, our emails
different in other parts of the UK. So in Wales, for example, whereas I'm sure many people know, there's a Welsh Commissioner for Older People, Helena Hurd-Potts, woman. I think their rights arguments run in a very different way. There's much more within the Welsh government. There's a lot that they're much more receptive. And I think that's certainly true in Scotland as well. But in England, we're in a completely different place, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I know. And yes, I mean, as you know, we have a campaign linked to our health and wellbeing manifesto for a Commissioner for Older People for England, in exactly the same way as Northern Ireland and Wales have. And I think there's so much difference. We see it within NPC, having organisations in regions, how much more they are able to effectively challenge and potentially change for their population. Whereas in England, like I say, you get ignored, or you get a letter back replying to one half of your question and not the question that you really want answered. So yeah, it's quite typical, I think. Can I just touch on digital phone lines? December 2025.
Yeah.
There hasn't, we've known about it for some time, and Jonathan attends meetings, and I know you and Age UK are involved, Caroline, but I don't think the general public as a mass population actually understand what's happening. In 2025, BT are getting rid of all their analog phone lines, and it will go to digital. And that means every household has to have the internet for you to be able to use your phone. Now, when you think, we talked about the television license going, the major contact instrument for older people is the analog phone. Yeah. What we do know is the expectation is, if you don't use your internet line connected to your phone, then it's expected that you will use your mobile phone. And one of the issues that we came across was the fact that because you plug this phone into the wall, if there's a power cut, you're phoneless. And the expectation is that everybody will have a mobile phone as a backup, excuse me. So we're quite concerned about that. And I wondered if Age UK had anything in the pipeline on that.
Yeah, my colleagues are probably going to the same meetings that your colleagues are going to, I expect, about all of this stuff. My understanding is that actually you're not going to be forced to go online and have the internet. If you haven't got the internet, then you'll be given a gadget which enables you to continue using your phone as you're currently using it. So there shouldn't, now, that's what's supposed to happen. I think for us, the issue is less that this is a huge kind of strategic threat, but more how is this going to be operationalized? How's it actually going to work for people on the ground? Is everyone who needs that extra help going to get it? Would it be something that's complex to do for yourself? What if you're someone who hasn't got someone to help you? Does it mean crawling underneath something and plugging something in and you're physically unable to do it? So those are the sorts of questions that we're more worried about at the moment, just about how it's going to work in practice. But in principle, as far as we're aware, this doesn't mean that suddenly someone who's only got a landline isn't online is going to find themselves forced to buy a mobile phone if they want to still keep talking to people. That's our take on it.
Thank you. I mean, it's good for that clarification, because that was the last we heard, that everybody was expected to have a mobile phone as backup, which is completely crazy. We'll leave it there, Caroline. Thank you for your time. I hope you can stay around. Might have some more questions at the end. There's a lot on the chat, but we need to move on. We're over time now. Right, and next I'd like to introduce Dr. Jennifer Butte. Now, as older people, our members have found it really difficult getting a GP appointment anytime, even before the pandemic. But during lockdown, we all understood that surgeries needed to be protected from COVID. And digital video consultations often helped fill the gap. But as things return to normal, the emergency measures seem to become the norm. Now, Dr. Jennifer Butte spent a lifetime as a GP, but she had to retire with early signs of dementia. But she has remained active, working to help sufferers and their families through her charity Glorious Opportunity. But as her illness progresses, she would like to see her GP face-to-face, and she's finding that difficult to do. So welcome, Jennifer, and can you tell us a bit about what happened to you and why you feel it's so difficult to get face-to-face appointments with your GP? Is it acceptable, and what can be done?
Well, yes, I once worked in general practice, and I was the executive partner of one of the largest practices in Southampton involved with medical education. And I believed in the relationship of the doctor and patient was of the utmost importance. So much relates to trust, and many factors have contributed to its erosion over the years, and this has decreased further during the pandemic. And hospital doctors and nurses have been applauded during COVID, whereas GPs have been increasingly criticised, and partially because of the great difficulties of access, with more patients consequently going to A&E. In previous times, GPs were gatekeepers, and apart from major trauma, the GP would be called first. And if necessary, the GP would call the ambulance. But medicine has moved on, and years of insufficient places for medical students and lack of funding have resulted in insufficient numbers of medical personnel for our increasing population and our lengthening lifespan. I mean, many pensioners will remember the days of turning up at the doctor's surgery and the doors being locked at 10 o'clock in the morning, waiting sometimes hours to be seen. So the appointment system was a brilliant implementation. But as doctors, we sought to treat and care for all, no matter what the state of their bodies, minds, or brains. It meant long hours. This is no longer happening. And the difficulty in access has increased the divide. I've been trying to get a face-to-face appointment with my GP for over a year. Phone calls would reach a non-medically qualified person who made unreasonable and incorrect decisions. Receptionists do not have medical qualifications or medical training. An internet inquiry, such as Ask My GP, assumes that one can use a computer and have access to the internet. But also, it involves registering at the surgery. And I couldn't do that because I needed ID, such as a driving license. Well, I don't have one anymore, and many pensioners don't either. Or I had to have a utility bill, which in our paperless societies we no longer receive. So I was told the doctor needed to speak to me to decide if they needed to see me. Fine. When can they do that? Oh, sorry, we've got no appointments for them to phone you. Oh, well, I can wait. Sorry, we don't make appointments more than 2 weeks in advance. Okay, I will phone in 2 weeks. And it would be a repeat, exactly the same. I did manage a virtual consultation with a neurologist whose camera was either not working or turned off, even though I mentioned that. So I had no idea whether they were responding to me or even aware I was there. They wrote a letter to my GP, which I did not consider in any way to be accurate. But as I hadn't been able to see them, I had no idea if they were even listening to me. They could have been reading a medical journal for all I knew. This is not the medicine I practiced or how I retained communication and relationships with my patients for whom I cared deeply. And my condition got worse. And after 10 more weeks of futile attempts at obtaining a consultation over the phone, I got the management of the village where I now live, Dementia Inclusive Village, to intercede, to contact the surgery. And miraculously, within a day, the GP phoned me. And I was seen the next week. The surgery, face to face. There was one other patient in the waiting room. And the doctor acknowledged that I was necessary to have seen me. I know 2 people here who died due to lack of face-to-face consultation over the last 18 months because the phone calls resulted in incorrect diagnosis. Family eventually took one to A&E, as I've said before, who immediately referred them to the appropriate oncology department. And only last evening, I heard about another one who also died because they couldn't get access to the GP. And how can you possibly examine patients over the phone or even on camera? I can remember patients which I would see at the end of my day in the urgent clinics, complaining of constipation or urinary problem, which one immediately realized on examination was neither much more serious or significant. But once the patient has been seen and thoroughly examined, then phone calls or virtual consultations might be more convenient for both parties. See, I still remember a dear old lady to whom I'd offered an appointment at 7:45 a.m., trying to be helpful because there were no other appointments that day. After as she was leaving after appropriate treatment, she said, "Did I know that there were no buses before 8 o'clock where she lived?" I felt ashamed, as later in the day, I did see patients who could certainly have been dealt with over the phone. So we need to be able to mix and match. There needs to be choice, doesn't there? But you see, we need to acknowledge that some can't cope with computers or mobile phones. And when I wrote the blog that got me invited to this, I was amazed at the impassioned responses from other doctors, clinical directors, and clinical leads, all saying the same, that it could only be a follow-up to a first face-to-face consultation. One retired GP said, "It's not unusual for words to say one thing and expressions to say something different." Another said, "We lost my mum a month ago. She couldn't see her doctor face-to-face for over a year. And even though she had 2 emergency admissions and falls and referrals, she died still waiting for that appointment." Another said, "If you pay privately, consultations miraculously become available. We're delivering a 2-tier system and we will face a tsunami of late diagnosis, meaning complex care catch-up. Programs for essential operations and necessary treatment is going to hit our NHS far harder than COVID." You see, medical training has changed. It relies, I think, too much on technology. When I trained, there weren't any scanning machines, but we could diagnose conditions by seeing and examining the patient. Certain conditions have a specific smell. Diphtheria, typhoid, diabetic ketosis, even certain cancers. It's true. They don't get taught that nowadays. And when I worked in Africa, these skills were essential. And how someone walks, their facial expressions, their hand unsteadiness. Again, typical of certain conditions that can't be diagnosed over the phone. But as has been said earlier this morning, recent statistics can give the wrong impression. According to NHS digital data, in August 2021, 55% of patients were seen on the same day or within 1 day of making an appointment, which was a 10% improvement on the same period in 2019. Well, what about all those that were unable to make an appointment? And last weekend, there was stated a figure of 19,500 people who were in the wings waiting with undiagnosed cancer due to lack of access to face-to-face appointments. But you see, technology can be an immense problem to older people who fear it. They've never used a computer or mobile phone. During COVID in my retirement village, we were effectively locked up for months. And I tried very hard to provide group activities with and for residents using Zoom. And with the help of staff and volunteers, even people in their 80s and 90s were able to join with iPads already set up with internet contact facilities, some with smartphones. But now that we're allowed face-to-face, it stopped. We need to provide training, reassurance, opportunity and motivation for older people who do want to gain those skills. They can't do it by themselves. And if you're ill, the last thing you want is the extra stress of coping with an unfamiliar web camera or situation. It's essential for GPs to maintain face-to-face consultations available to patients, and perhaps then continuing with web camera consultations for those that feel comfortable with it, and phone calls for appropriate follow-up, but there needs to be choice.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's completely resonated with people that are watching and listening. This is from Fran Griffiths, who's down in NPC Wales. Dr. Boot, it seems that GPs have no control over the technology that is being brought in, and it means procedures are being created to suit the technology, not the other way around. And that seems to be happening quite a lot. There's another one that says, Dr. Boot, you are so right, and it is great to see you. Thank you for coming. And it makes me feel quite happy, yeah, that I'm not wrong. You know, the feelings that people have, we tend to not want to bother the NHS or GPs, particularly during a pandemic, and now even a bit after, because they're still under that stressful and exhaustive state. So people don't just, you know, want to turn up at their surgery, they want to do it the proper way. And I think what you've done is given those people that were wondering if it was their fault and wondering if they were being slightly unkind to the GP surgery, you've given them the understanding that their rights are their rights. And I think it's absolutely brilliant that you've been able to come here today and explain that. And I'll just give an example that I had. Somebody phoned me up and they'd fallen at home. And they'd rung their GP surgery and said, look, I've fallen, I've hurt my ankle. Can I have an appointment? And was told, oh, just take a photograph of it and download it to the surgery website. So the reason she was phoning me in tears was that not only does she not have a computer, she doesn't actually own a camera. Yeah. And so I actually said to her, look, do you have a friendly neighbour? She said, well, I do next door, but he works. I don't want to bother him. I said, well, might just take a chance and ask him. So he took her to the GP. They waited outside until they were seen in the car. And he phoned me afterwards and said that she was fine. And he would have helped her whenever she'd asked. So for her not to wait until he'd finished work or had his tea or whatever. So that's just one out of many that we're getting. And there are others where inappropriately people have been asked to undress parts of their body to have a look at on camera. Now, to me, that's the kind of stuff that goes on in surgeries, you know, private between doctor and patient, as you say. And what can you see on a camera on somebody's, you know, body? As you say, you can't test somebody's hearing on screen. You can't diagnose them on screen. But more and more, we're finding that algorithms and stuff like that are coming into play, rather than the human body between the machine and the GP. So I'll thank you very much for coming, and I'm sure that we'll be in touch with you again. I wish you all the best with your lovely project, great opportunities. And I think it's so lovely that what you're doing for people with dementia, and that you're still so active, and long may you remain so. So thank you for coming. If you just hang around, we might have some more questions. Right, and we need to move swiftly on. I'd like to introduce now Jenny Sims, the chair of our NPC Digital Working Party. Now, Jenny's standing in for David Briggs, who wrote a really excellent paper on scams and some recommendations for what the NPC might do in terms of tackling them. So thank you, Jenny, for stepping in at the last moment, and she's going to put David's presentation up on the screen, and we will see where we are with what the NPC needs to do. Okay, Jenny, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. Before I look at David's presentation, I'd like to say that, like Joe Stevens, I'm also from Cardiff, and I promise everyone I didn't give her a copy of our report, but the thing she said this morning I was very encouraged by, because a lot of what we're asking for and suggesting that the NPC campaigns on, she's already got there, she's up there, and she's doing it, but I didn't leak anything, promise. And I would just like to address something that Caroline Abraham said about government giving diddly squat to training on online for, you know, getting older people online. And of course, we're in Wales, NPC Wales, we're in a more fortunate position. The Welsh government has given a lot of money to Digital Communities Wales for getting people online. And yesterday, NPC Wales had an executive committee and a council, and we had a speaker from Digital Community Wales telling people what they could be doing. But in addition, I asked her on scams if they would talk to people, and apart from what they've got online, come out and give people all sorts of information about how to avoid scams. And she said, yes, they can do bespoke sessions for us. And so we will be, as of yesterday, putting in process Digital Community Wales helping our members cope with scams. So that's a bit of background from what's happened today. Coming back to the introduction to this report, if I can give you a bit of background to it, this report was only presented to the Executive Committee 2 weeks ago. Some background to the Digital Working Party. We came into existence just 2 years ago as a result of a biennial delegates conference and a successful motion launching the Connections for All campaign. We had our first Digital Working Party in September 2019, and a lot of what we do, we collect the research, what's out there, put some reports together, and come up with some recommendations for the NPC on how to help members. This particular report has been put together by 3 members. David Briggs has headed it up and written it. My only part in this particular report has been to revise and help with the recommendations. I'm not going to go into the details of what's in it because a lot have already been said today. The report from Caroline, we've been given lots of stats on the scope of the problem, the scale of the problem, which is huge. I mean, we just make, And the principles we've got in there about, the older people more likely to be targeted. And so we have said in the report, that the situation is dire, that the problem keeps escalating, and we have to do something about it with lots of other people, with partners. I come back to the challenges in tackling scams here, and it's a challenge for all of us, at all levels of society. I'm looking here at the bullet point agencies required to deal with them. But what we've highlighted is the agencies that are required to deal with it. Some of them are failing. And at NPC level, we're a campaigning organisation. And what Jo, I'm heartened to see, so she's going to go after them too. And where we need to, where they're failing, the NPC needs to be challenging government. Can I go on to the next slide, please, Jonathan? We've got the scope of the problem here, that older people are more likely to be targeted. But as we said, we're running out of time, and we've gone through these issues with previous speakers. Shall I go on to the next problem? Sorry, next slide. Again, I'm going through. I'm not sure who said something about older people not reporting scams enough, and one of the reasons is embarrassment and shame. So one of our recommendations is really to encourage our members, please report the scams. A big part of our report was being concerned about victim blaming. And again, in action for the NPC throughout our organisation is to stand up and call out, whether it's the media, and I work for the media, so I'm a journalist, so call us out, where you see stories that are victim blame, this mustn't happen. And coming back onto the next slide, fear of what will happen. Well, fear of what will happen is one of the big barriers to older people going online. So this, obviously, tackling this fear issue is something that we need to be tackling at all levels in the NPC. Lack of confidence in the authorities to deal with it. Well, again, we're coming back to what the report is recommending, is that we go to government and we go to the Financial Conduct Authority and others where they're failing, and we call them out, and we continue to demand that they're more effective. Moving on. Jonathan? That's it. So I'm going to be brief and cut mine short, and to thank Dave for all that he's put into this so eloquently. I'm sorry that he's not been able to join us today and present, because he's much more knowledgeable on the details of this. Can I just look at the slide on our recommendations, Jonathan, please? Okay. The NPC itself has come up with a very good article, bulletin, a briefing on scams, and we hope that the NPC will continue to raise awareness through such briefings. As it said, clarity for actions older people can take them for themselves. But again, the Digital Working Party will continue to do its research and pass on to the NPC anything new that can be done, anything that's coming from the banks, etc. We're constantly researching anything new, and so we will be continually updating the NPC on what can be done. I've mentioned victim blaming, that we've got to call people out. And lastly, just be strong on again, coming back to what Caroline talked about earlier, calling for more funding from the government, from others, for not just tackling digital inclusion, but exclusion as well. And Caroline, can I just tell you one thing, if you weren't aware of it? The NPC has supported your call earlier this year for more funding, and we have, as Jan Short said, we've written to the Digital Secretary, and we have mentioned your report and that we back you in that. So I can just say our report was for the EC, but we ended our report by saying we do not want to reinvent the wheel. We simply want to ensure that the wheels that are already there are effective, and that's what we will be doing. And I leave it at that. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jenny. That is absolutely brilliant. I think I just kind of have a little bit of, you can have a bit of a laugh at this, right? We wrote to the Action Against Fraud people, inviting them to this meeting. And we hadn't had a reply, and we thought, all right, it's just another government agency ignoring older people. However, this morning, we got an email apologising, saying they were very sorry, but our email had gone into their junk mail. I can see Caroline laughing. I laughed at it. Jenny's laughing as well. Gone into their junk mail, had only just opened it, and they obviously couldn't provide someone for today. So we'll be following that up. I think we might be having more of these kind of things, particularly with the Financial Conduct Authority, with Action on Fraud and anyone else that we can get our hands on to try and make this the scam issue a much higher profile with the government that they obviously want it to be, but also to look at the exclusion of people who are unable, don't want to, have been online, choose not to for whatever reason, health or others. So I think that was us, basically. I'd also like to go to an email that we got from Gwen Cook this morning. Thank you, Gwen. This is the explanation that she gives in her email is quite typical of what we get from our members. Gwen started using a computer when she was at work about 30 years ago, and she found it all right. And she has now one at home, but she finds it an intrusion with all the updates on packages and being asked for this and asked for that and asked for everything else. Unfortunately, her eyesight's also deteriorating. So she's got a 15-inch laptop and she just cannot see the things online. She's a touch typist, so she manages, and she's managed really well in getting this email to us, but it must be stressful for her. Yeah. And then she talks about the expense. Her landlord, which is a local council, recently organised for some digital company to connect each tenant to their fastest ever broadband system. Yeah. So the whole estate was wired up, and now each of them has a coil of wire outside their flat, just asking to be wired up. Yeah. It's only £25 a month, they claim. Yeah. How much? And what about the equipment? You know, and that's not included in the 25 quid a month. So it is beyond her means, and it will be beyond the means of other people who are not accessed to benefits. And she does have a £7 internet connection from Phone Co-op, but that includes all the frills and the expensive bits and free antivirus services and stuff like that. So to be able to use it comfortably at home, she needs to invest in £100 large screen equipment. And, you know, she just can't afford it. She finds communication via email uncomfortable. She still prefers letters. And obviously with her eyesight, it causes her lots of pain and problems. And as she says at the bottom, she's not alone. There'll be members that this will resonate with. We hear from them all the time. There'll be people potentially watching and listening here that aren't our members and feel the same. So this is not a one-off thing. You know, digital inclusion stroke exclusion is a big priority for us alongside a lot of the other policies that we do. So we're not going to be going away, going to be back. For those people who've been asking about presentations and things like that, Jonathan will put them on our website. If you need a postal copy, please put your address in the chat function and we'll make sure that we print some off and send you by post. And that is what we normally do. I have quite a lot of questions that we don't have time to answer. So again, Jonathan will save them off and we'll go through them one by one and see where they belong. So be aware that we may be writing to you, Caroline and Jennifer, and obviously contacting Jenny through our own email. But I think it's really important to understand that whilst we are getting older, we are not worthless. And yet we seem to get treated as though we're second class. Everywhere around us now is around ageism, the ageist society that we're in, and the assumption that we all wear the same overcoat and clothes. And it, you know, it doesn't fit. One size does not fit all. So I think there's a lot of work to be done around with Caroline and Age UK, with Jennifer and with Joe, and, you know, potentially pushing those things through the government, even though they don't like to hear from us. But we continue to do it because not to do so is, you know, it's impossible. Age discrimination is alive and kicking in the UK. The problem is, as Joe said, and other people have said, getting age discrimination through a court procedure is very difficult because most of the things that affect age also affect other people. We could claim they affect older people more, but that is not in itself a simple case for, you know, taking discrimination. But we will be meeting with Jackie Colleen shortly. She's offered to do a call with us and look at what's come through on their consultation and to talk to us about discrimination and exclusion. So watch this space. I thank everybody for coming. Joe, she's already gone. Caroline, Judith, Jennifer, it's been absolutely brilliant to have you here. We'll stay in touch with you if you don't mind. Yeah. Jenny, thanks for stepping in at really short notice, and our best wishes to David for him to feel a bit better than he does today. And of course, none of this happens without Bev and Jonathan. So thank you to all of those. We wish you well. And normally we would say safe journey home, but just switch off your computer and have a nice cup of tea. So thank you for coming, and we'll be seeing you again. Right, bye-bye.
Thank you. Yeah.